So Ali's poetry, most of which, as you point out, was not written by him, the predictions of the round in which he would knock out his opponent, the relentless self-admiration, referring to himself in the third person, all elements of the Ali persona from the very beginning. But how much did these elements turn the press, and in many cases the boxing public at that time, against him? Because one thing that struck me as I reviewed his early fights is how much he was booed, even before his public conversion to Islam and his draft resistance.
Right, he was booed, and he was seen as a brat, a sore sport. Sportsmanship was still a big deal back in those days. You were supposed to respect your opponent, and you weren't supposed to gloat. And this was all especially true for a black athlete. Think about how Joe Louis had to control himself, wasn't even allowed to raise his hands in the air after he knocked out a white opponent. He had to show humility. So along comes this kid who's cocky and calling himself the greatest when he hasn't won anything yet, taunting his opponents and predicting what round he's going to win. It all struck especially the older white reporters as being in poor taste.
So let's talk about industrialization, specifically the advances in transportation technology that played such a crucial role in the rise of professional baseball. Train travel, trolleys, streetcars. The development of the two major leagues in the 1870s could never have really happened without that. So Paul, talk about the impact of 19th century transportation on the rise of baseball, their interconnectedness.
Sure. A lot of the early teams were actually owned by streetcar companies because they thought baseball would be a useful thing to drive traffic on the streetcar. Even in the primitive real estate world of the 19th century, it was expensive to put a baseball park in the heart of downtown. You needed too much space. So they would often build them on the edge in neighborhoods that were just developing at that point. That's certainly the case in Boston, where Fenway Park was built by the Taylor family, owners of the Boston Red Sox at the time, who also had a lot of significant real estate interests and were developing the Fenway area.
So with Rockefeller out of the running for the number 2 spot, Nixon follows the advice of party leaders, picks Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. as his running mate, old political family, World War II veteran, 2 terms as senator from Massachusetts. Actually, he was beaten by JFK in '52. So what was the thought process behind this pick? Was there a better available choice for Nixon?
There has to have been a better choice. The thing that I always recall about Henry Cabot Lodge, and you may not know this, is Henry Cabot Lodge was a very, very tall man, and Richard Nixon was very short. And for the two of them to appear together on a podium was wrong. It was really a mistake for a tall vice presidential candidate to stand next to a short presidential candidate. And that really made Nixon look terrible.
Yeah, Nixon, man, he always seemed to get the short end of the stick when it came to optics, especially that year.
Yes, I know.
Okay, let's get to the candidates. In the top 4 in the Real Clear Politics poll average in Iowa are, first of all, Biden and Bernie, separated by just 4 percentage points, followed by Mayor Pete Buttigieg at 18.7%, then Warren at 16 even. Now, before we take a closer look at these top-tier contenders, I mean, you sound a bit more bullish on Amy Klobuchar than I am. I thought she needed a big night at the debate on Tuesday and failed to have one. But Klobuchar aside, looking at Andrew Yang, Bloomberg, and Steyer, with the possible exception of Bloomberg, who seems to be making a bit of a splash. He just made a big ad buy for the Super Bowl. But are these campaigns essentially on death watch? Or could there be some kind of stunning Cinderella upset in Iowa?
Probably not, and certainly not victory in Iowa. Right now, it would be historically, in the modern primary era, a historical outlier if any of those candidates won the nomination, or at least won a majority of the delegates before the convention started. One thing to remember is that there's a real scenario here where no candidate wins the majority of delegates and we go into a contested convention.
You know, these days, everything, including sports, is politicized, but the Olympics, the modern Olympics, that is, have really always had that, I guess because of their international status. And the Olympics in October of 1968 took place during an especially fraught period in our history. Martin Luther King murdered earlier that year, Robert Kennedy after that, Vietnam, the riots at the Democratic Convention. So all this was in the air, and Foreman's first personal encounter with organized politics happened during his Olympic training when a representative of Richard Nixon asked for his support in the upcoming election, which he declined when he learned that Nixon planned to cut funding for the Job Corps. But talk about how politics manifested itself at the '68 Olympics and where George Foreman fit into that.
Yeah, so this is another scene where lots of people have given the snapshot, and the image that is etched in our sort of collective memories is of Foreman waving the flag after winning the gold medal, which wasn't really unique, but coming a few days after Smith and Carlos' Black Power protest, and some of the other protest movements that we shouldn't forget from those Olympics, not just from African-American athletes, but also from athletes who were under the Soviet bloc and their protests against the Soviet Union.
It's tough. I mean, sometimes I think the Yankees, just because of what the franchise is, tend to believe their own press clippings and maybe don't bring the same intensity level against the lesser teams.
Yeah, but isn't that like a cop-out?
Of course. No, it's terrible. And it absolutely shouldn't happen. I'm just saying it could be what happens. But again, these are tough questions for outsiders to get a grip on.
You can't analyze it, really. All you can analyze is that for whatever reason, the team does not perform as well against bad teams. And the thing is, there's so many bad teams in the league. You've got your playoff teams, and then you've got a bunch of really, really terrible teams.
Now, just shifting gears for a minute, you tell some stories in your book that show Joe Frazier's Good Samaritan side. He helped a number of people over the years, strangers and intimates. He was solicitous of boxers who had fallen on hard times, not just financially, but taking a personal interest as well. So, Mark, was this generous side of Frazier, which, by the way, Ali had as well, was this an outgrowth of how he was brought up? Talk about Frazier's generosity, which was known by those within his orbit, but perhaps not as much to the public. He didn't make a big deal about it.
Well, it wasn't really known by me until I started researching the book, but I view it as an outgrowth of his Baptist upbringing. I think his parents instilled that in him, and I was really touched by it.
I want to talk about another familiar face the Mets re-signed, shortstop Jose Reyes. Not great last year with the bat. Actually, his first half was a disaster, but much better after the All-Star break. He's versatile. And again, that veteran leadership, it's really something that you can't measure with stats. And Reyes, he was a real mentor last year to rookie shortstop Ahmed Rosario. So with Reyes, Cabrera, Flores, Frazier, and Gonzalez, the Mets have some real options there. So your thoughts, Danny, on this New York Mets infield?
Well, there's another player that we didn't mention, and I certainly hope that we'll see him in 2018. That's T.J. Rivera from the Bronx. I think what ended up happening with him playing at third base, it was pretty much a strain on that shoulder of his where he had to obviously undergo Tommy John surgery.
And as you said, there were some hard feelings from Canzoneri's camp that he'd been robbed, that it was a hometown decision. So the rematch in September of 1933 was held in New York at Barney's insistence. Huge event. The governor was there, Babe Ruth was there, plus 50,000 fans, which is kind of amazing considering how the economy was just so bottomed out. But there was another kind of sub-theme that evening. Hitler had been made dictator of Germany just before the first fight with Canzoneri, and there was a huge rally in Nuremberg that got international attention just a week before the rematch, where supposed Aryan superiority was proclaimed. So that was very much in the air and on Barney's shoulders as a Jewish fighter. Actually, it was funny. I noticed on YouTube, the ring announcer, Joe Humphreys, introduces Ross as the popular American Hebrew of Chicago, which I thought was kind of amusing. But talk about the build-up to that rematch, Doug, and the fight itself, which was a visual spectacle too, with massive backdrops depicting scenes from the Hebrew Bible, right?
Yeah, well, just before that, they had a pageant, I guess, to counteract the horrible news out of Germany. Nobody could foresee the Holocaust, but even the fact that Hitler had come to power and there were open signs of such grotesque anti-Semitism. There was a big event, a pageant, it was called, at the Polo Grounds, and it was a pageant of the history of the Jewish people.